Hey everyone, my name is Paras Chopra, and today I'm with Professor Micheal Corballis. He's Professor Emeritus at Department of Psychology at University of Auckland in New Zealand. His research interests intersect cognitive neuroscience with evolution and language. He's deeply interested in questions like how did language evolve, why our brains are asymmetrical, and ultimately what it means to be human. He's an author of several books on language and mind. Today, we are going to discuss with him why he believes languages evolved gradually and why some version of language existed much before human sapiens arrived on the scene. So that's evolution of language is going to be our topic today. And I welcome Professor Micheal Corballis today. So welcome, Professor.
Thank you. It's nice to be with you from a long distance.
Fantastic. So before we begin, Professor, I was very curious about knowing how did you get interested in this question of evolution of languages? What was your career trajectory that led you to getting interested in studying this?
Well, it was very indirect, really. I had long had an interest in asymmetry, handedness, and why the brain is asymmetrical. And of course, language is part of that because language is represented asymmetrically in the brain. So I really started, though, with an interest in symmetry, oddly enough. But then I began to understand that we are not only symmetrical, we're also asymmetrical. So in some respects, of course, our hands look much alike, but we do rather different things with our right and left hands. And that led me gradually into wondering why. And of course, language then began to enter the picture.
Right. So by asymmetry, just to be clear, do you mean the left and right hemispheres of our brain are specialized in different functions?
Yes, I mean bilateral asymmetry, the difference between left and right, and the fact that they often have different functions, but then they often have the same functions. So many of the things we do with our hands, of course, are the same, but some of them are different. So I'm interested in why we are in some respects symmetrical and in some respects not.
Okay, so before we talk about language, maybe it'll be good to understand why is that so, why asymmetry exists, since you study that as well.
Why asymmetry exists, or why
why our brains are asymmetrical?
Well, I think it's probably inefficient to have the two sides of the brain doing exactly the same thing. So when you have complicated functions, it's more symmetrical to divide them between the two sides of the brain. Otherwise, you have duplication, and duplication in the brain would be inefficient, I think.
Wouldn't that be more redundant? If one thing goes bad, the other thing takes over. I mean,
well, that can be a help, of course, but it's also using up valuable space. There's only a certain amount of room, I think, inside the head for the brain to do all its complicated functions. The brain is very complicated. And if you simply had the two sides duplicated, it would be a waste of space. If you were building a motor car, for example, an automobile, you wouldn't want to make the engine perfectly symmetrical. That would be wasteful and inefficient. So I think once you get the brain doing complicated things instead of just responding to the environment, then it's efficient to have the two sides of the brain somewhat differently specialized.
Right. So what you're saying is asymmetry is efficient by default, and symmetry in general just wastes space and resources because they're two of everything.
Well, that's one of the problems. We do have two hands. That's quite useful. We have two legs, two eyes, two ears. That works quite well because we are responding to space. And the two sides of the space are more or less indifferent. We tend to do the same things on one side of space as on the other. So under those circumstances, I think symmetry is helpful. But if you have things going on that are not connected directly with space and that are complicated, then I think it's more natural and efficient to have asymmetry.
Right. And is asymmetry common across animal brains or non-human brains?
Well, I used to argue once, I wrote a book once called The Lopsided Ape, which is us, in which I tried to argue that it's something special to humans, but that's clearly wrong. We now know that there are lots of asymmetries in other animals, even things like handedness and the different sides of the brain functioning differently in nature. So we are not so special after all. And you can find examples it's always, I think, a kind of a compromise between symmetry and asymmetry. Because all animals live in a world where the two sides of space are much the same. So in that sense, they have evolved to be symmetrical. Again, with two hands, two arms, two legs, two eyes, and all the rest of it. But once you get more complicated things with the brain having to do computations, then I think it tends to become asymmetrical.
Okay. I mean, it's amazing the story of every time we feel humans are special in some way, we find examples in biology how we share that feature with many other creatures.
Oh, yes, I think so. We have a great temptation to want to think we're special. In other words, we're always looking for ways to describe ourselves as special and as superior to all other animals. But I think that's a big mischief in a way. It leads us into sort of magical thinking and notions that we are somehow superior and special and have to be treated differently. But we are one of several billion species, and there's no reason to think we are that special.
Right. So back to languages, and I was listening to your talks and reading your papers, and you do talk about Noam Chomsky, who's one of the prominent linguists. So I was interested in understanding, what do you think Noam Chomsky gets right and what he gets wrong about languages?
Well, I think what he gets wrong really is the idea that language suddenly emerged in our species within the last 100,000 years. So he's got the idea it's so special, it all came about at once in a single jump. Sometimes he calls it a great leap forward, as though suddenly humans found language. They found it, in his view, long after we actually emerged as a species. So we probably emerged as a species about 200,000 years ago. But he thinks that language occurred about within 100,000 years ago, maybe 50,000 years ago even. He even thinks it occurred in a single individual, and that individual then spread it to all other people. Now, I don't think that makes any sense. I mean, that doesn't make any evolutionary sense, and it sounds like a miracle. And miracles don't happen in biological evolution. At least I don't think they do. But I think he got some things right. He got the complexity of language right. He got the idea that language wasn't just a question of simple learning. It's got complicated structures, which I think is one reason why it's asymmetrical, incidentally. So his descriptions of how language works and how grammar works, I think, is probably basically right.
Okay. I mean, this idea that language emerged suddenly was obviously proposed much after theory of evolution was well entrenched. So I'm very curious, how did this idea gain mainstream acceptance in linguists community when evolution was demonstrably it was well entrenched by the time Noam Chomsky made this. So how does this idea gain any traction at all?
Well, there are always people who like to discredit evolution, to say it's wrong. And Chomsky comes very close to saying evolution is simply wrong. Evolution got it wrong. There are ways things happen in biology that don't follow Darwinian principles. That's how he gets around it, I think. But I think Darwin needs to be defended. I mean, we need to sort of try to understand how things did happen gradually. So that's my challenge, if you like. But Chomsky sort of takes it as read that evolution must, in this case, be mistaken.
What evidence did he give to promote this idea that it came about suddenly? Because anything that happens it requires a lot of evidence.
That it came about suddenly?
Yes, it should require.
Well, I think there's a lot of what I call special pleading, which is partly the desire to regard humans as special. Part of it's based on artifacts that are discovered, like discovery of symbolic representations, things like art and that sort of thing, which appeared quite recently in human evolution. So there's a lot of credence given to that, I think, the idea that it looks as though symbolic thought happened quite recently in human evolution. But then evidence from history or from paleontology is always biased because the more recent stuff is the more evident. And it's become increasingly apparent, I think, that you can go back further in human evolution and find examples that look like symbolism well before the period that Chomsky is talking about, like 50 or 80,000 years ago. So I think that's part of it. Also, of course, no other animal has anything that is very like human language. So there's a big gap between the way humans speak and communicate and the way chimpanzees do. But that overlooks the fact that there's sometimes something like 6 million years between ourselves and the common origin of chimpanzees and humans. So somehow people forget that. There's a long period of time during which language and complicated functions could have evolved quite slowly and according to Darwinian principles. You don't have to say it happened in the last 50,000 years when you've got 6 million years to play with.
Right. It just sounds implausible that one fine day a mutation happened and suddenly we got the ability to communicate in languages.
That's right. I mean, Chomsky is very influential, but I don't think he really understands biology. He understands language, and he understands that language is complicated. And he's got really interesting ideas about how language actually works. But he also believes, I think, that something as complicated as that couldn't have evolved part by part, couldn't have evolved slowly because it's kind of an overall package. And because it's an overall package that sort of fits together, he doesn't believe it could have evolved in piece by piece. People used to think that about the eye, by the way. They made the same argument about the eye. It couldn't possibly have evolved. It's too perfect. But in fact, now it's fairly well understood that the eye did evolve from parts of the skin that gradually changed and developed light, responses to light and so forth. And I think you have to really adopt the same view with respect to language. So the idea that it's a big package, packages can't evolve piece by piece, but I think they can and they have to.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of tragic that similar arguments are gaining somewhat appeal today in creationism approach, where it sometimes boggles my mind that people still. I think scientifically attacking a scientific theory is fine, but dogmatism that things couldn't make sense because they don't appeal to intuition, that is a little sort of hard to digest.
That's right, but evolution's hard to take in a way too. Lots of people object to the idea of evolution. Partly it happens so slowly you can't see it happening, but it must have happened. Right. So
right.
A lot of people don't like the idea of evolution because it suggests that we evolved from apes and we evolved from primitive creatures. And a lot of people will try to fight that idea, I think. I don't think Chomsky's like that, but a lot of people, creationists, simply don't want to believe that we evolved gradually from being some more primitive creature.
Okay. So, Professor, then how did language evolve? Let's come to the main question.
Well, that's a big question.
I know.
Well, I think one of the theories I have that language didn't start as speech. Because if you look at vocal communication in other creatures, in our closest relatives, chimpanzees and other apes, the closest they come to language is not through vocalization at all. Their vocalizations tend to be involuntary, emotional, and they don't sort of tell you about what they did yesterday. They don't make propositions. They just give cries, really, or calls. So the nearest thing to language, I think, in a chimpanzee is gesture, the way they communicate with their bodies. So I think language probably started as a system involving the body and was visual, not auditory. They probably made noises while they gestured, but I think the way other animals communicate in language-like ways is with their bodies. And especially apes, because apes are a bit like us. They've got hands they can use, arms they can move around, bodies that are flexible. And that's a natural way to communicate, I think. If I go to another country like India and I try to communicate with people, it's no use me trying to speak. So I try to do it by pointing and gesturing and making movements, making pantomimes. And I think that's how language began.
Okay. And
That doesn't
how
explain the complexities of language, by the way. I mean, there's another story to tell there, I think.
Yeah. So you're saying that it was gestural, and that's how probably our common ancestors with chimpanzees, the apes, they started communicating in that way, and not really through the vocal communication that we have today.
That's what I think. We don't know, of course, because we've got all those silent centuries, going back something like 6,000 years, during which all this must have happened. And my suggestion would be that if you went back 1,000 years, you'd find them doing something like pantomime to each other. Maybe with some vocalization built in. It's probably a gradual process, but I think it would be mostly like pantomime, miming things. And that's what we do. I mean, that's, of course, a bit like sign language. Sign language is a proper language. And I think probably if you went back a few centuries, you'd probably, or maybe 1,000 years or so, you'd find something like sign language.
Right. I mean, this, of course, doesn't leave archaeological evidence. So we can't dig and find gestural communication. So what evidence do we have that points towards that this is likely to what have happened?
Well, partly, I think part of the evidence is if you start with a chimpanzee, supposing you start with a chimpanzee and you try to make evolution happen, right? I think it would be silly to start with trying to teach the animal to vocalize, right? And in fact, chimpanzee research started that way. They started trying to teach chimpanzees to speak, but they found it didn't work. So they moved on to gesture. So the earliest studies with chimpanzees trying to teach them language involved trying to teach them gestural systems. So if you were sort of in charge of evolution, if you wanted to take a chimpanzee through 6 million years and turn it into a linguistic creature, I think you would have to start with something like gesture or bodily movements, because that's what chimpanzees do better. Now, all of the rest has to be conjecture, really, because we don't really know what happened in those 6 million years. But we've still got 6 million years to play with.
Yeah. Okay. So 6 million years ago, our ancestors are communicating through gestures. And then how did we end up communicating like in voice, having all the rich complexity we have?
Let me say first that I think probably 6 million years is actually too far back, because it's probably more like 3 million years ago when we had bipedalism, that is proper walking on two legs. Mm-hmm. And that freed the arms up. And it also led to things like tool manufacture and those sorts of things. And I think tool manufacture is another good example of a complex activity that begins to be lateralized. So one hand begins to be dominant. So I think you've got that kind of evidence, but it was not so much 6 million years ago. It probably began with the Pleistocene, which started about 3 million years ago.
Okay.
Now, I think in a way, gestural communication is not very efficient. For a start, it takes a lot of energy. So I think what gradually happened is that we gradually moved the whole system to the face. Now, the face is very convenient because it's kind of located in a single spot. Its movements of the face are quite articulate. I mean, you can move the face. It's also something that we naturally look at. So I think gradually it moved from being gestural to the face. Now, of course, we still use our hands. We still gesture. I'm actually doing it a bit now, and I'm trying to stop. But mostly the system then moved to the face because it became more efficient and became more energy efficient. Talking involves very little energy, but people who use sign language quickly become exhausted.
Okay.
It takes a lot of energy. So I think it gradually moved to the face. Now, part of the face is invisible. So part of the way we talk involves the parts of the face that are inside the mouth. Now, that meant we had to find some way to make my tongue movements, my larynx movements, my lip movements accessible so that people can understand them. And that's where it became auditory. Oh. So what speech really does is make your mouth gestures available by sound and not by sight, partly by sight, because we can still lip read. But basically it moved, I think, into the face and became accessible by sound.
Right.
Now, that's a pretty big theory, really, because one assumes that all this happened over the last 3 million years.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, we don't
And
know, really, of course, because we weren't there.
yeah, and I mean, it's also very complicated. I mean, it's a difficult task to prove a theory that doesn't leave archaeological record. But the so I'm curious. I mean, just a meta question: how do sort of debates in evolutionary community happen when the evidence, I mean, definitive evidence is not there? You can't dig something and say this happened.
No, that's true. I mean, that's the whole problem with evolution in a way, because we weren't there for most of it. We weren't there for all of it, really.
Yeah.
I mean, evolution happened, but we weren't there. So we're just a tiny little instant of time in the evolutionary picture. So almost everything that happens in evolution has to be inferred from what we can discover from fossils. I mean, there is increasing evidence from fossils and now from ancient DNA. So we could perhaps begin to build up a picture from what we can discover, but it's still not very much. Getting better. I mean, we would like to be able to get the DNA sequence of Neanderthals, which are very similar to the human one, and say that, well, they had the means to, to produce vocal sounds that are articulate.
So when
it's a game, you see. The whole thing's a kind of game because you don't have direct evidence, and that's what makes it fun in a way.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if your theory is correct. Would that leave an imprint on anatomy in terms of maybe things that support vocal cords and other parts?
Well, you don't. The trouble is that the only thing you get from fossils is not vocal cords or anything or soft tissue. What you get is bones.
Yeah.
So you really got to go on the bone anatomy. The size of the skull is helpful. The shape of the skull, we know a little bit about that. But you don't have any information on the vocal cords themselves. I mean, you might get some information about how the vocal cords must have fit inside the skull, but you don't have direct information about the vocal cords. Now, with ancient DNA, we may be able to get more information that is functional. That if we understand the genetics of language, then we can maybe get closer to understanding from ancient DNA whether the genetics are there in ancient creatures. We're moving very slowly on that one. We know a bit more about the Neanderthals. I think what we know about the Neanderthals, who are very similar to us, is that they probably could speak.
Okay.
Based on what we know about ancient DNA and what we know about their skulls and the shapes of their heads. And they also, incidentally, mated with humans.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I guess we have some part of our DNA really does come from Neanderthals.
Yes. I mean, I sort of suspect they weren't actually different, really. I mean, they were just another tribe.
Okay.
But see, that runs against the idea we've got to regard ourselves as though we are superior and special.
True. So, Professor, what were the evolutionary pressures that actually made us communicate in richer and richer ways? Why didn't things stop at just gestures? Why did we have to just evolve such a rich form of communication? And why did that just happen with our lineage? Why didn't, say, chimpanzees and others evolve similar rich communication patterns?
Well, that's a good question, and I don't know the full answer, but we can grope toward part of it, I think. I think that the critical period is probably the Pleistocene, when humans kind of stopped living in forested environments, or when apes started, and lived on started, of course, in Africa on the savannah, where they had really to develop cohesion in groups, because it was a very dangerous part of the world. There are lots of nasty cats, tigers, not tigers actually, lions and cheetahs, and tigers are, I think, in India, aren't they? Anyway, there were lots of sort of dangerous predators, and I think the solution was to become much more cohesive and develop groups. So once you have to try and survive in a group, you have to have very efficient communication so that you can plan how you can go hunting, how you can find food, how you can escape predation, how you can develop places to live that are safe and guarded. So I think that also led to the manufacture of tools and weapons and so forth. So all that led to what's sometimes called the cognitive niche. We lived in a niche involving more elaborate thought and more elaborate communication. Now, that again is guesswork, but it's based on the fact that we kind of know what happened over evolution. We were once tree-dwelling creatures that was quite safe. But once you move into these kinds of environments, you need to have to develop a kind of social bonding, a social culture. And we were not natural predators. I mean, we had to have some way to defend ourselves against, the big dangerous cats on the African savannah. Something like that.
The evolutionary pressure drove our ancestors to have better form of communication. And this sort of I see a sort of like a feedback loop where better communication enabled us to have better tools, and better tools enabled us to have better communication.
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, several things were built into this during the Pleistocene. There were bipedalism, which freed up the hands, better control of the hands and ability to make things, bigger brains. I mean, the brain tripled in size. It became 3 times as big. So all of these things, I think, conspired in the process of becoming socialized and becoming culturadized, becoming cultures, and forming what's sometimes called the cognitive niche. So I think they were evolutionary pressures that probably began with the Pleistocene about 3 million years ago. And as you say, it was a kind of a feedback loop.
Right. So when communication sort of evolved from gestures to face to vocal, our hands got free to do even more things. So it just made sense in that sense.
That's right. So once you can use your mouth on your face to communicate, you can do other things with your hands, right? So that's a kind of a feedback thing again. And also you can explain what you're doing, right? If I want to teach you how to make something, I can do it with my hands, but I can talk at the same time. So I think this is one big loop, if you like, that kind of makes us more articulate and also makes us more efficient with our hands.
Right. So the conjecture really is that these conditions came together which were beneficial for human lineage, which probably did not happen to say chimpanzee lineage or even dog or cats, because their brains didn't grow, and by virtue of that they didn't have complex communication capacity.
I think that has to be sort of right. I think it's more than beneficial. I think it was probably essential, for survival. It was a survival thing. And I think it was probably the big change in the ecology, from being a tree-dwelling primate under the cover of forests and suddenly thrust into a savanna, which was kind of open. It was a big change that other animals probably didn't have to forego in the same way.
Right. And gestures are, by definition, gestural. They signify what you're trying to communicate. But our language today is more or less devoid of actual signs. It's just abstract. So this seems a really big leap, trying to suggest that you are hungry, to using a word like hungry that has nothing to do with food. How did that happen?
That's a good question. I think it probably started as sort of pictorial, so you mimed it, and that made its meaning more or less clear. But even sign language has become what's called conventionalized. If you live in a culture and sort of build up networks with other people, then you can begin to have an understanding that something means something, even if it doesn't look like it. So I think, and that happens, I think, in almost all communication. Even in monkeys have communication systems that will signal predators, but the signals don't sound anything like the predators. There's a particular signal that vervet monkeys use when they want to signal the presence of a snake, right? But the signal they use doesn't sound like a snake, and of course doesn't look like a snake. So I think what happens when communication systems develop, they lose what's called the iconic aspect, and that makes them more efficient. So you don't have to sort of go through the procedure of trying to demonstrate something that looks like or sounds like something you want to convey. It can be done by convention.
Okay.
So that's the kind of argument anyway.
I think this connects to the very basic question about how communication is even possible. If I'm making any gestures or making sound, how does the receiver make inference about what I'm trying to say? And I think it connects to what you call as mental time travel or theory of mind, that there has to be something pre-existing, because otherwise it's impossible to guess what the other person is trying to say.
Right. I think theory of mind probably goes a long way back. We sort of through living with other creatures, whether you're a person or a rabbit or a dog or whatever, you begin to get an understanding of what's going on in another animal's mind. And I think that's very well developed, again, through this loop business in humans. So we're pretty good at understanding what's going on in other people's minds, and it's absolutely necessary if we're going to communicate with them. So I sort of understand, I think, what's going on in your mind right now. Sometimes you surprise me, but not often, or quite often, actually, with good questions. But I think in order to communicate, you have to have an understanding of what's going on in another person's mind. So the actual sounds of language are only part of communication, right? I mean, what I'm sort of doing now is I'm making sounds that you understand, but I'm also, in a sense, massaging your mind.
Yeah.
Sort of trying to bring it onto the same wavelength as mine. And you're doing the same with me.
Yeah.
So I think the whole theory of mind thing is a very critical part of language and probably of communication generally, actually.
Right. So the way I understood this was theory of mind goes way back, where it was essential for creatures to guess what's happening with other creatures' minds. And what communication does is narrow down the possibilities. Like, it just narrows down the subset of what you're really trying to, what's in your mind. I mean, when I say hungry, and I'm guessing you must be hungry, I think that's way more communicative than if I have no idea what could be going in your mind.
That's very astute of you. I am a little bit hungry, but not very. That's right. I mean, this is also controversial because there are people who still argue that theory of mind is something that only humans have. But again, I think that's part of the desire to establish ourselves as superior. So all sorts of things like mental time travel. I mean, I used to think mental time travel was something that only humans have. But the more I look at animal work and the more I think about it, the more I realize we're not special there either. I think other animals have memories, they can anticipate futures, and they could probably anticipate what's going on in other animals' minds. Frans de Waal, who's, I don't know whether you know, I've mentioned his work occasionally, does quite a lot of work on the ability of animals to have empathy. Okay. In other words, they know whether another animal is not well or sad or whatever, and to some extent what other animals are thinking. I think they do much more of that than is generally realized. And again, it's part of the natural tendency that goes back to religions, I think, to regard ourselves as somehow superior.
Right. And
certainly true of the Christian religion. I mean, we are, we're half angels. We're not quite up there with the gods, but we are close. And that's the sort of part of the natural tendency to regard ourselves as superior.
For the benefit of listeners, can you define what mental time travel is and also theory of mind, how they connect?
Well, mental time travel, I'm not sure that they're that connected. I think they're both aspects of the way we think, and they're both, a necessary part of thought. Mental time travel is simply, it started out as what's called episodic memory, our ability to relive past experiences. So you can probably, in your mind, imagine what you did yesterday or what you did last week or the week before. Now, I think that's just part of the ability also to imagine what you might do tomorrow or what you might do the next day. And it's also part of the ability to actually invent. In other words, to create stories about what you might do or what people might do. So I think all of that is mental time travel, the ability to move away from the present and imagine what might have happened what did happen in the past, or might have happened, what will happen in the future, or what could happen, a sheer fantasy. So I think a lot of our lives are spent not in the present at all. Our minds wander. We think about what we're going to the dentist tomorrow. We think about, what we did yesterday, or the terrible mistake that we made at some party somewhere, or whatever. So we are built to spend a lot of our lives not in the present. Now, that's where language is important, of course, because what language does is enable to communicate about things that are not present.
Right.
If you lived entirely in the present, you wouldn't need language at all. You could just point to things or share your experiences. But in order to explain what you did yesterday, or what you might do tomorrow, or what you did on your last trip to wherever you went, then you need language. And that's what language, I think, is for. It's to talk about or communicate about things that are not in the present. Now, I think theory of mind is a bit different. It's the ability to sort of understand what other people are thinking. And you need to have that kind of head start if you're going to communicate with another person. You can't just sit there and know what they're thinking. So you use language to kind of give a few clues to what you want to communicate. And most of it is picked up by the other person, by understanding what the other person has in their minds already, I think.
Right. I mean, in one way, they're sort of connected in the sense in mental time travel. You travel to past and future, but in theory of mind, you're traveling to the other person's mind to imagine
that's
what
right.
that
It's
person
a kind of
might.
Travel. You're traveling into the other person's mind. Yes, that's a way to put it. That's right. It's not traveling in time and space. It's sort of traveling in space, I suppose, but it's not quite the same thing as imagining you're in France or that you're in another country.
Yeah.
You're imagining you're in another person's mind, which is part of imagining what it's like to be that person, which is slightly different.
Right. And this imagination, I mean, our imagination is generative in the sense that we can connect situations that never happened and imagine that they might happen. And in the similar way, language is also generative. Many of the sentences have never been uttered before, yet we understand. Do you think there's a connection between these two things?
Absolutely. I mean, I don't think language is generative for its own sake. I think language is generative because thought is generative, right? So all language is really doing is conveying the generativity of your thought to somebody else. Now, that's where I think Chomsky is perhaps not quite right. He thinks that language is itself generative, but it's only generative because it's evolved to help us communicate generative ideas. So I think the generativity of language comes from imagination, from thought itself, from mental time travel and those things. So that's where the generativity things, it's in our thought processes. Chomsky half believes that, by the way. He talks about I language, which is internal language. And then he talks about externalization, which is taking your internal language and producing spoken or signed language. But I language itself is actually thought. I mean, Chomsky's a bit confusing about this, but he's really talking about something that he thinks goes on in people's heads, in people's minds, but he thinks it's unique to humans. I think imagination goes far back in evolution. I think even cats and dogs dream. They have imaginations. They have thoughts that probably take them away from the present. We have probably honed that skill, perhaps more than a dog, but who knows? I mean, a dog can't tell you. So I think these things really go far back. It's not something that happened 50,000 years ago, as Chomsky seems to think. But Chomsky does at least say that it's thought that, gives rise to this ability to externalize and to talk and to have language. I think people misunderstand Chomsky in that respect. He actually does think it's a thought process, but it's a very particular one in his view. I think it's a very general one. I think imagination and mental time travel are probably something that all animals that move around in space have probably evolved.
Yeah.
If you're an animal that moves around in space, you need to remember where you've been. You need to understand where you might go next. You need to perhaps make plans. So I think it's something that goes a long way back. And I think it underlies a lot of what we use language for, to communicate these things.
In one of the papers I was reading that you had written, you had written that imagination is much more general, like what you're saying. And it's just the communication of that rich imagination that probably differentiates humans from other animals. And you had cited, and I remember I'd seen this research also where a rat has this thing called place neurons, where
Yes.
they light
Yes.
up when rats are imagining where to go, whether to go left and right. So
Yes.
it's for sure something is going on in a rat's mind as well.
Yes, this is going on in the rat mind. It seems pretty clear, and these place neurons, place cells, are indication of that, because they kind of map out little journeys in the animal's mind. The animal seems to be thinking about a maze that it's been in, movements that it might make next time it's in that maze, and maybe even imagination. But they can't, of course, they don't have the language to tell you that. You've got to have a neuroscientist to put an electrode into the animal's brain in order to understand what the animal is thinking. But at least we now know, or think we know, what the animal is thinking. It just doesn't have the communication skills to communicate it. At least it doesn't have the skills to communicate it to humans. Maybe they communicate it to each other. I don't know. Maybe they squeak to each other in ways that explain their mental time travels. But I doubt it. I think that's something that humans have probably developed more than other creatures have.
Right. So sometimes this question, it is one of the most common questions that comes up when we talk about thought and language. And I don't even know whether it's the right way to phrase it, but what do we think in if we don't think in languages?
Well, we certainly think in images. I think you can imagine yourself in different places, and you can sort of pick out the landmarks where you've been. You can sort of imagine in images the people that were there. Of course, language is so highly skilled that we can quickly put labels, verbal labels on these things. But I think at base, they're not verbal at all. They're kind of pictures. Now, it gets a bit more complicated if you start talking about ideas, I think. So we build up theories of things, ideas about things. A lot of that's still also done in pictures, I think, sometimes quite abstract kinds of pictures. So basically, I think we have a kind of spatio-temporal understanding of the world that comes out as pictures and movements and the like. So I think it's fairly pictorial, actually.
Right. It does sometimes feel like you are thinking in language, but I think you can quickly see why that's not the generic case. For example, people who talk in sign language, I was reading some accounts that they think in sign language, and other
Yes.
people who may be completely deaf and dumb, they must be thinking something as well. They obviously don't think in language or even sign language.
Well, I think it's a difficult one, because if you are imagining a scene and imagining people, you are very quick to put verbal labels on it. So it sounds as though you're thinking in language, but what you're really doing is applying linguistic or verbal labels to the things that you're thinking about. So I think a lot of it is not really thinking in language. It's converting your thoughts into language so that you can then communicate it. There may be some ways in which we do think in language, though. I don't know if you are solving logical questions or thinking in algebraic terms or something. Language is also part of our mind. We've filled our mind up with verbal labels. The real purpose of those verbal labels is to be able to talk about the things we're thinking about, right? But maybe you can also use them in a kind of way. I can think about the shape of a word, I suppose.
Yeah.
It's still a verbal thing, or the sound of it, but it's also an image.
Right.
So I think really we don't think in language. We use language to attach to our thoughts, and that enables us to communicate it.
Yeah. I feel sometimes when I feel like I'm thinking in language, I'm trying to create another version of a person to have conversations with. That's what feels like the feedback loop. My brain is simulating another person so that my thought is richer.
That's true. I guess we're both doing that now. We're trying to think about the kinds of words we're going to use to ask the question or answer the question. So yes, I think in that sense we are probably using language as kind of images, aren't we? We're sort of then kind of construct a sound pattern that I'm going to try on you when I next try to answer one of your difficult questions.
Yeah. And sometimes, in dreams, obviously, somehow language is muted or sometimes completely missing, but it still feels like a real imagination. So that just shows language is not essential for thought. It's just a way for communicating what you're thinking.
I think so. And of course, you can think about people talking, dream about people talking. I mean, so language occurs in your thoughts in that sense. But it's more as a kind of image of a person talking and an understanding of the person talking, rather than forming the essence of what your dream is about, I think. It's a subtle difference, I think.
Right. Yeah. So, Professor, I mean, if say let's go back in the communication, our gestures evolved into face communication, and then it evolved to vocal communication. If that's the case, why do we have such a wide variety of languages? Why do we have 5,000, 6,000 plus languages, all non easily interpretable by members
Yes,
of?
I think what happened when humans left out of Africa, they spread all over the world and they formed separate communities. I think part of the problem of, or the purpose of language is actually to prevent communication. In other words, they communicate with each other, but it also excludes outsiders, right? So language is partly secret. It's secret to different cultures, not so much now because everybody seems to understand English, which is a shame. But as language evolved, I think it evolved in separate pockets, and it partly to hold groups together and keep outsiders out. Right. So language is a kind of not only a communication system, it's a barrier. So it sets up as a way of recognize people as being foreigners.
Yeah.
And you don't want to have anything to do with them. Right. We're not so much like that anymore, but I think throughout sort of the history of the way languages and people evolved in different cultures in different parts of the world, they wanted to develop their own cultures and keep them special so that, freeloaders didn't come in from outside and try to impose themselves on your culture. It's a kind of bleak view in a way of how cultures evolved. But I think all cultures do that. They try to develop ways to make themselves distinctive. And that's also a way of trying to exclude outsiders. And I think all languages and all cultures have done that. It's something we need to break down, I suspect. But I think that's why you have 7,000 different languages in the world. It's a way of keeping them special. And so you know which group you belong to, but you also know the people who don't belong.
Right. I mean, it's such a counterintuitive and mind-boggling view that languages, the diversity of language is there to exclude and not to include. And I think it makes sense because there is no evolutionary or cultural pressure to have uniform language. In fact, I was just imagining if there is a culture war or a tribe war happening, it's actually advantageous for you to have the secret that the other tribe doesn't understand, so that you can communicate strategies without leaking what you're trying to say.
I think that's right. I sort of suspect languages may have started in very small units like families. Mm-hmm. And as families sort of accumulated and got to be larger groups, then they would sort of preserve their identity as a group through their language, and then developed, of course, into tribes, and then into nations. What we really need now is trying to get, I don't know whether we really do or not. Should we all have the same language? Would that be good or not?
In that sense, languages were really like the first ciphers, like the ones used in World War II or World War I.
That's exactly right. Yep, they have been used as ciphers, as a secret talk, so that the enemy couldn't understand what you're talking about. Now, do we still need that, or would it be better to move toward a common language for everybody so that there would be no secrets and with luck, no wars? But I don't know. That's a difficult question. It's a very contemporary question. In my country, there's a big move to try to preserve the Maori language,
right?
Which is probably a good thing to do. But it's so other people from other parts of the world or other cultures don't understand that language. So it's an example of a language that's got a sort of a fence around it in a way. And they think, and they may be right, that they need to have that.
I think it's related to this question whether any language is inherently more efficient or better than any other language. I don't know what's research suggests, and I don't know whether that's an area of research for you, but I'd love to get your views on whether that's true or it's just not true at all.
I mean, people have tried to make efficient languages like Esperanto, but they don't work. I think languages are probably too bound to culture to say that one language is superior to another. But I'm not sure. I think, I mean, English in one sense is different. It has many more words than most languages, but that's because, there's lots of things to talk about, and they've borrowed lots of languages. In some ways, I think it's a very inefficient language because it's borrowed from other languages. So that may be one dimension. English is sort of supposed to be hard to learn because it's irregular, and its irregularity comes from borrowing words from other languages. That is maybe a bad thing, but some people think it's an enrichment, so I don't know.
Maybe, I mean, answering this question is as hard as answering whether one culture is superior to another. And that's fundamentally, I think, a political question rather than a...
It's too political, isn't it? I mean, I think you have to take cultures on their own merits, really. I mean, they've evolved the way they have. They've created the people they have. They've adapted to the communities that they live. So in that sense, they're probably pretty efficient. I mean, they have evolved in a particular context to do the things that they need to do. So it's probably wrong to think in terms of efficiency in a general sense. I think languages and cultures do what they need to do in their own contexts. Maybe it becomes a problem, though, when you start getting mixtures of cultures, when you get colonization and that kind of thing. Perhaps that's when it becomes a problem.
Right. And languages are always evolving. They're also not something fixed in stone.
Yes, and I think they partly evolved from this business of secrecy again. Teenagers learn their languages so their parents can't understand them. People who adopt professions like scientists learn languages, and that often keeps non-scientists out. So I think the evolution of language also has that hidden, not exactly hidden, but that component of secrecy, of sort of creating bonds, and they are often exclusionary bonds, I think.
It's amazing how this in-group and out-group dynamic is still continuing. I mean, if you listen to teenagers of today, it's just sometimes impossible to understand what they're trying to say.
Absolutely. Yes, I don't understand my grandchildren at all.
So, Professor, again, one question that comes up when we talk about languages is how children pick up any language at all. There just seems something inherent in the brain where without explicitly teaching young kids, they pick up languages. How does that happen?
This is Chomsky again. Chomsky talks about a language acquisition device that's in all children's heads, and children very quickly pick up the language they're exposed to. But again, he treats it as a kind of miracle. I mean, I think children are just very quick to learn associations of any sort. So if you want to teach a child anything, whether it's language or whether it's even to play golf, goodness knows some of these kids are playing golf now, or to make things, I just think we have built in a very fast learning in children in particular. So it's an evolutionary thing. We have evolved so that the young of the species make associations very quickly. I mean, that sounds a bit like magic too, but Chomsky thinks it's a special device for language. I think it's a special device for learning. And that children are natural associators. They very quickly learn to associate things. And of course, after a while, as they get older, they're not able to do it anymore. I mean, piano playing or anything like that is something that children, it's best to learn these things young. Not only language, but anything that involves learning associations and so forth, and movements.
But do you feel it's, I was just contrasting vocal language with written language. And vocal language just seems universal. Each human on earth seems to have some sort of communication, but there's still many people who don't know how to read and write. What would
Yeah.
explain that difference?
Well, I think in a sense we have evolved longer to understand, gesture probably, but also, so gesture comes quickly. Vocal language also, there's been enough. It's obviously gone back far enough in evolution that it's pretty much stamped in the procedures for learning vocal language. But I think written language had to kind of colonize the part of the brain, actually the part of the brain that does pattern recognition. So there's some evidence that the part of the brain that recognizes faces has been taken over by speech patterns, by written patterns. And it's also created an asymmetry of itself in the brain, because the right side of the brain is still specialized more or less for face recognition, but the left side has been colonized by what's called word recognition. So I think that's something that had to sort of emerge late in evolution, really. Probably give us another, million years and it'll be natural. But I think it is a bit unnatural because it has to use a part of the brain that's involved for general pattern recognition, including face recognition and object recognition.
Right.
So I think it takes longer to learn to read and write than it takes to learn to speak for that reason.
Do you think it's also because written language, is written language much more recent than the vocal language, and B, is it?
Yes, that's right. I mean, the vocal language is, although Chomsky thinks it all happened 50,000 years ago, it's probably much longer in evolution. So we have kind of built in the kind of brain mechanisms that allow us to rapidly pick up vocal language, but we have not built them in because you're right. I mean, I don't know what proportion of the world still does not read and write,
right.
But it's unnatural because it's come about much more recently. So it has to colonize part of the brain that's actually used for something else.
Yeah, and it seems there is a lot of, when it comes to vocal language, cultural transmission. If kids are around their parents who speak, they pick up speaking, but there is probably not a similar pressure on. I mean, if you know vocal language for most of the history, there was no pressure for you to learn how to read and write. So that change just kept on going on. And there's still people who don't know how to read and write today.
Yeah, well, that's right. I think you have to, of course, know how to speak before you can learn how to read and write too. So it's not any colonized part of the brain, but it's all a colonized speech. Right. So you have to learn to map the symbols that you're reading and writing onto the way you speak. So that has to, in a way, come first. I don't know that there's any evidence that you could learn to read and write before you learn to speak or gesture, for that matter. So it has to be built on reading and writing. So I think kids learn to read and write much better if their parents also, spend a lot of time talking to them. And of course, the more you expose them to books and reading and writing, the better they will learn. But I think there are still some kids, for whatever reason, who don't learn easily, even though they're raised in environments where they should learn.
Yeah.
So that's dyslexia, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Since we are at the end of our slotted time, I'm going to ask you a speculative question. What do you think is future of language? And it's as broad as it can get.
Well, one future, of course, is electronic. And I think language is changing, under the influence of electronics. So even writing seems to be disappearing, and people are sort of sitting at keyboards and they're developing thumbs that flash over the keyboard of their cell phones. I can't do it, right? So I think it's a form of language because you're using your hands and so forth. And in a way, it's returning to gesture, isn't it? So it's returning to a form of communication where we're gesturing with our thumbs and creating pictures that are then transmitted to the other end of the world, if you want to communicate with people in England. So I suspect electronics in the longer term will have a big influence, not only in the manner of communicating, but perhaps in the way we communicate too. Because my grandchildren tell me now that they communicate with Instagrams. Mm-hmm. So instead of sort of describing in words what you did today, you simply send a picture. So I think language may revert to something pictorial, something visual, something gestural quite quickly if it all becomes electronic, especially if we're all in lockdown. We can't even meet face to face because of COVID. So I think sort of community pressures will change the way language works, and is doing that already, I think.
Yeah, and
even in terms of what we express things.
These community pressures seems to go both ways. I mean, with internet, there is more cohesion in number of people trying to communicate to each other. I mean, we are communicating. I'm in India, you're in New Zealand, but at the same time, there's also more diversity in niches. So I really don't know where the communication pressure will take us, whether we'll communicate more similarly to each other, or whether we'll communicate so differently that we can't understand other groups at all.
That could happen, or maybe that we'll all understand each other much better if we start sending Instagrams to everybody. But one thing I've learned not to do is try and predict the future, because you're nearly always wrong.
That's a very astute observation to end our conversation.
Well, I'm nearly always wrong too, so you shouldn't be talking.
Thank you, Professor. It was lovely talking to you. I learned a lot of things.
Well, thank you for talking to me. I learned a lot of things too.
Bye-bye. Take care.
Bye-bye. Nice to talk to you.
Nice to talk to you as well.